So this is an excerpt from a short story that's part of a collection of short stories all about the same character, and this portion is actually called The Beast. After a brisk walk down the hall to visit the bathroom and then the kitchen, Arthur sat down ready to work. He hunched his shoulders and leaned over the desk, always getting right down to the task. As soon as he was finished, he'd put on a clean black t-shirt and a wool cap and go out to a coffee shop. Cafes, like bars and clubs, were the perfect prowling ground for Arthur, perhaps even more perfect than his dim and boozy evening haunts. A different type of girl could be met at a cafe, and Arthur told himself that he liked this type of girl better. She was probably working on something, reading even. He could get an angle on her intellect. She wasn't all done up, and he liked that. There weren't other mouths watering over the naked flesh of her shoulders. Truly, Arthur felt more confident caffeinated than he did drunk. The blood would go surging through every vein and screaming around the fine capillaries in his pale ski-slope nose. He got giddy, ready to burst at the seams. This would happen sometime after the second or third cup of coffee. Since he spent most nights out, Arthur needed the first ample cup and a half to fully awaken his senses. This particular day, a Thursday, the skies were clear and the sidewalks windswept as Arthur strode the 5 blocks to a place called Pardis. This cafe had class, despite the kitschy magazine racks and a large selection of hipster patrons, and Arthur liked it. He found a seat in the loft at the little counter overlooking the entrance. There was an empty stool on either side of him, and it was 11:30 a.m., just before the big lunch rush. Perfect timing. He set down his cap on the counter along with a moleskin notebook and pen, which he pulled from his back pocket, and went downstairs for his first coffee and a biscotti. When Arthur had returned and settled into his seat, people were beginning to trickle through the door. A few office-mate pairs wandered up to the baristas and ordered without hesitation what must have been their usual. Arthur jotted down a few notes for a one-act play that he'd been thinking of writing. He decided he didn't like the main character and flipped to the next blank page. Outside, a young woman in wool trousers had stopped to consider the specials on the sandwich board sign. She ground the heel of one pump into the sidewalk for a moment and then turned in through the door. Arthur hadn't seen her yet, nor she him. By now, a line had formed, and the woman took off her sunglasses and reapplied lip balm while she waited. Arthur surveyed the cafe from his perch in the loft and noticed her as she dug through her shoulder bag. Her hair was pulled back into a bun that bobbed up at him as she bent her head in search of her wallet. There were 2 other girls in line behind her, a bit younger and wearing jeans. They had come in together and would be harder to approach, though Arthur did like the cleavage display on the heavier of the 2. He continued to watch as the first woman placed her order and moved aside. A man in a beanie plopped down on the stool to Arthur's left, effectively distracting him. He scratched at his greasy shoulder-length hair and began to pull books and a laptop up from his backpack on the floor. When everything had been arranged, the man took up the equivalent of the space 2 people could have used. Arthur surveyed the man's books. "You reading Ibsen for a class?" he asked. This was not just to be friendly, though he was a sociable person. It was good to open a line of conversation with someone he wasn't interested in, so that it might not seem so forward when he did approach a possible candidate for his quest. "Yeah, I've got to study him, but I like him pretty well," the man said. "Is there an outlet over there?" He'd gotten as far as turning the laptop on, only to find it had little battery power left. He waved the end of a cord at Arthur. "Have I sat next to you before? You look familiar." Arthur took the cord from him and thrust it into the socket between his feet. "I come here a lot," he answered, "but I'm sorry, I don't remember your name if we've met." "Tom," the man said, holding out an ink-smudged hand. "Sorry, I've been helping my girlfriend with this project. Damn stuff stains your skin." Arthur shook Tom's hand and shifted on his stool. Below, the 2 girls, the one of whom possessed the ample chest, were taking their sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. They poured milk into their paper coffee cups and strolled out the door. Arthur heard one of the line cooks call out, "Karen." There was a long queue now to order, and tables downstairs were full. Arthur watched a woman with a baby in a sling around her mother, trying not to drip soup onto his head as she brought the spoon to her mouth, and listened to her friend across the table relate a heavily gestured anecdote. Tom was fanning the pages of his Ibsen text as if only to create a breeze for himself. Arthur hunched back over his notebook. He was halfway through a sentence when the woman in wool trousers sat down on his right. His pen rushed to the end of the line, dotted an I in exhilaration, and paused in the air. He proceeded to stare straight ahead while observing the woman's movements from the corner of his eye. Peripheral vision is an acquired skill. Arthur could have used it for other purposes, but it always shut off when it wasn't trained on one of the many possible objects of his romantic journey. The week before, he might not have sidled into a pile of dog shit at the park as he made way for two women out with their grandmother. And last month, when a friend was coming to pick up his old TV, he might not have left the still-functioning set on the curb while he went back inside to find the remote, had he noticed that the neighborhood junk collector's truck was turning onto his block. For Arthur, life was a bit of a folly sometimes. The woman next to him at parties was having a salad with walnuts and cranberries and goat cheese sprinkled on top. "That looks good," Arthur turned and said to her. The woman smiled and smoothed the paper napkin over her knees. She wasn't going to reply. This was no discouragement. It only heightened the game for Arthur. No response meant, try again, keep on going. "Is that the special?" The woman nodded. Already she was beginning to regret her seating choice, but there were no other options. It was one of those rotten moments when the fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, flight being the only civilized option, and in this civilized situation, the path to flee did not exist. The woman settled into her seat, hoping that if she kept her head down, she'd be left alone, the old ostrich tactic. She might have guessed that many other women had felt the same in Arthur's presence. "I had that yesterday," Tom chimed in from the other end of the counter, craning his neck over Arthur's notebook to all of the woman's food. Anything to avoid Ibsen, Arthur thought. "You'll enjoy it. The girl in the kitchen said they got the chef from some family-run gig in Marin." The woman said, still nodding and lifting her fork. "You'll have to let us know how it is," Arthur made a point to get in the last word, beginning to worry that Tom might try to steal her. He had a girlfriend, or so he'd said, but all the more reason for him to exercise his flirting skills. He had fewer opportunities to use them. Now Arthur had to come up with something else to write in his notebook. There had been a time when he simply wrote whatever was running through his mind at the moment. A bottom shelf in the room with the bow window was crammed with notebooks that contained strings of unsituated consciousness, amongst other better collected drips and drabs. Perhaps if he pulled them all together, he'd have a poem. At the moment, however, with the woman sitting so close, Arthur realized the chance that she might glance over his shoulder and read the page, so he didn't catalog his thoughts about her. Instead, he wrote a heading in the center of the page, "Stream of Consciousness Poem," and underneath, "Valentine's Day." He thought he'd done some good work on a Valentine's Day once. All his notebook entries were dated, so it wouldn't be difficult to find out. Now what? Arthur hated himself at moments like these when he began to get anxious about what would happen next, and annoyed at having to occupy himself in the interim. He could never be a tadpole and swim around a stagnant pond, he thought. In the notebook, he started a new line, "Tadpole, stagnant pond, never." Metaphor was genius. Arthur kept going. Sediment, silt-covered tree branches. The woman next to Arthur was getting some serious work done too. She was hungry, but there was something more earnest than hunger in her pace. Broken boughs twined with barbed wire coiled around a rotten fence post leaning over, Arthur wrote. He noticed from the corner of his eye that the woman was halfway through her plate. She's the type to eat it all, he thought, admiring her efforts to stab a vinegar-soaked walnut. He had time. The outlet to a marsh, mallow, plants, and flower. As she moved on to the second side of her salad, the woman was eating neatly across the plate, not picking pieces here and there, as parties served salads perfectly tossed. She cocked her head to one side, leaning one temple on her non-dominant hand and staring over the edge of the loft to the tables below, somewhere over Arthur's hunched shoulder. Perhaps she looked out for a different spot to sit, but noting Arthur's enthusiasm for whatever he was scribbling away at, she relaxed and settled into some larger chunks of goat's cheese, caked on the tender leaves. The blue heron stops, steps into the mud, scares the frogs. She might be reading over his shoulder. Certainly she was, judging by the angle of her head, Arthur thought. He erased an unpoetic conjunction and stared straight ahead, attempting to look as though he were mentally searching for words, which was far from what he was doing. The corner of his mouth showed a twinge of nervousness. Did he have any of his cards left in his wallet? They were nice cards. He'd put some money into them because he handed out quality, but he didn't hand out his phone number, not so much because he didn't want women who were the principal recipients of his cards to have it, but because when he gave out his number, he would be disappointed if he didn't get one in return. And even if he did get one, he might call it too soon, say the wrong thing, or leave the wrong message. Arthur was a writer. He emailed women. He would offer his card, and it would be taken as a business-like exchange, or it could be something more. Younger women didn't have cards to exchange, but this woman, in the wool trousers, she would have. He delves further. None of the turtles These lines took a little while to jot down, and Arthur followed the words undistracted as they fell to the page. As he wrote stay on a final lonely line, the woman next to him was preparing to leave as quickly as she had eaten. Right on the money, Arthur laid the pen in the crease of his notebook and turned smiling to his female seatmate. Pretty good, was it? He asked, not thinking he might appear to be commenting on how fast she had finished her lunch. Lovely, thank you. They do amazing things with a salad here, she said, thinking if she strung together a full sentence, it might get her off the hook. Watch out, they'll sign you up to write a review talking like that, Arthur joked. The woman laughed a little, unsure what to do or think. Was this guy backhandedly insulting her? He had a sly type of half-grin, and his eyes had that county fair carny sort of sparkle. Seriously, Arthur went on as the woman gathered up her purse and scarf. You might be a writer, I can spot him. He reached into his wallet and pulled out what he hoped would be his card. Luck. It was one of his own that he handed her. He hadn't had time to make sure he had any of his own left, but there was always some business card tucked in the billfold. The woman took the card and stared at it. I see, but you're wrong in this case, she said. Have a good afternoon and good luck with your writing. She laid his card on the counter, shouldered her purse, and walked away. The carnage of her salad plate remained there by Arthur's elbow, crowned with a crumpled napkin, its oily rim threatening to drip on his card. Thanks for listening.